Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the 706 podcast, where we collectively decide which 706 movies are the best that were ever made and ever will be made, because we know the future. My name is Kirk. I am the host of this edition of the 706 podcast. I'm joined by my three reputable, prolific, compassionate, irreverent co-hosts. Let's go in this order and just say hi to the audience, give them a little something. Tony, Connor, and Anthony.
Hi guys, I'm Tony, and if you like how this sounds, you're gonna hear a lot more of it shortly. So
hey, I'm Connor.
Anthony.
We have the collective charisma tonight of a parole board hearing, and we will continue onward. So today we are discussing one movie that you might have heard of, unless you're absolutely a loser. And that movie, of course, is Spirited Away, 2001, written and directed by one Hayao Miyazaki. And I'm sure I mispronounced his first name. That's going to be the first mispronunciation of many, but let us focus on the topic at hand. So a TLDR, a TLDW, too long didn't watch, for Spirited Away. The problem with this movie is it's very hard to describe. It's quite ineffable in a sense. And I guess what I would say from my perspective is that it's a movie about a young girl, I think, 10-year-old girl, preteen girl, who is transported to the spirit world, finds a connection to the spirit world with her parents, who are cursed by an evil sorceress, and she goes on a long and, I guess, twisted and unimaginable journey, escapade, to lift the curse and reunite herself with her parents. I guess that's kind of the general gist of it, but we can obviously get into the details, the finer points here. What I want to do is I want to go around and, we usually do initial impressions. I want to go around and hear from everybody, but I also want to hear about your first experience with this film, and maybe just give me a little compare and contrast. If you want, you can tell me how familiar you are with the film in terms of, have you seen it 5 times? Is this your second viewing? Everybody here has seen it at least once. So we're going to have a layered perspective, I guess you might say. So let's start with Connor, since he graciously chose Spirited Away to be seen last episode. So Connor, why don't you lead us off? I know that's kind of a difficult spot to be in, but take it wherever you'd like.
Kirk, thank you. And thank you for your question as well. I'm trying to remember actually the first time I saw Spirited Away, and I cannot for the life of me actually remember what the context was. I can remember distinctly watching it on TV, on some station they were playing it. There was some kind of Miyazaki marathon or something. I remember watching Spirited Away. I think they probably showed Spirited Away multiple times, because it's kind of this big attraction, this kind of marquee type, experience, right? And I remember it being a big deal. Maybe not quite when it came out. I'm not sure if I can remember when it came out in 2006. I'm not sure I was completely cognizant of it coming out, but there was always just a buzz around it that followed it, I think, through the years. I'm not sure how it is now for people who are still getting into Miyazaki, but I think it's still kind of held up as kind of a very central, part of his oeuvre, right? And as I sort of provoked you when I first picked the movie, my feeling was that it's not my all-time favorite Miyazaki. I'm curious about what exactly makes it the sort of standout. And I think there's a lot of reasons. Some of it's a bit accidental. Some of it's just how it managed to come to the US. It had already won a lot of awards, and somehow it got a lot of attention at a certain time of year from a lot of, Western film critics. And maybe the time was ripe for a certain kind of animation, right, to make its way. Well, of course, there's always the question of is this anime or not, right? And I think we can call it anime from our perspective. Certainly it's Japanese animation. Of course, in Japan itself, they don't necessarily have like anime for them is not a distinct genre, right? There's just animation, period. And this happens to be an example of it. But even in Japan too, it had this kind of crossover appeal. Anyway, that's all very interesting. Obviously, right, it has a lot of what makes Miyazaki's movies great. It has this kind of coming of age element. It has this element of themes of kind of nature and humanity, modernity, etc. Nature versus modernity, you could say, right? It has these themes. And of course, right, the most memorable thing about it, right, is just some of these incredible moments and scenes that, like, unlike anything else that I've seen, or rather, compared to everything else that I've seen of Miyazaki's, I love almost all of his movies. I've seen almost all of them, I think. These are moments that really stick in your head just for their memorable quality and their beauty, right? So it's a standout in that respect. I have to say, though I hadn't articulated at the time when I picked it, I had this reservation about it. I think watching it this time, I find that versus all of my other, qualms with it being, too normie or too accessible or something like that. Sure, that might be some complaint, but more seriously, my main complaint with it is the second half of the movie, which I didn't really remember very well. And again, I think I realized why I didn't remember it, because it kind of lacks motivation. It's all very muddled. The whole movie, in a way, I think arguably more than his other movies, though they're all fantastic and kind of hard to predict and all this. In this case, it just kind of loses momentum. It gets kind of confusing. There's just too much kind of going on. So like, I really think at about the halfway point, the movie just starts to lose some of its energy. Whereas the first half is incredible. And that's my general take. I don't know if you guys can help me kind of work through that.
Do you have a specific point in mind when you say the second half? Like, where does it lose you?
So it's when No Face has appeared and we're with No Face. Chihiro is on her own kind of quest at this point. I think after we see Haku as the dragon being attacked, that's when it starts to kind of go off the rails, because then we kind of lose the thread of what's happening with No Face, and it kind of like there's all these other elements added in, especially kind of introducing Zeniba as this other character who's just. I remember being confused at the time, like when I must have first watched it, like what's going on with this other witch? Why are there two witches who look exactly alike? Anyway, that kind of thing. I think it really is around the halfway mark, even before we get to the kind of the climax of the No Face sort of episode, right, which is where he's eating everybody, right? I think it's kind of between that, right, or shortly before that. That's the point which I would identify. I don't know if you guys feel similarly. I think I can back this up. I really do feel that this is something. There's something there, but of course, I have many positive things to say about it. But that's my provocation to bring to the table for this time.
You're right. That is quite spicy. Connor coming in off the top rope. We appreciate it here at the 706. All opinions are valid. And, I think just my kind of initial impression of what and I got a similar vibe today. I actually watched, I did a double feature. I did Princess Mononoke followed by Spirited Away today. I wanted to get a little back to back just to contrast the differing styles. I think they're 5 years apart. I think Princess Mononoke precedes Spirited Away by about 5 years. So just to see stylistically, in terms of like construction, plot construction, and metaphor, and thematically, of course. And I think that the second half is kind of a struggle for Miyazaki, because he tries to pull on all these differing strings and try to bring it and shape it into something that is cohesive and like a movie and a film that has this arc that we can relate to. And so I think maybe for me, I feel similarly that the second half is more about trying to flesh out the themes of the film, whereas the first half is almost about creating and enlivening this, animating this, literally this ethereal kind of unimaginable world, right? That's so fun and so vibrant. But I'll say more later. Do you have anything else you wanted to add right off the bat, Connor, or should we go to
Oh,
someone else?
just to that, Kirk. I mean, sorry, were you saying that this is a problem that Miyazaki generally has? Because it's something I actually kind of suspect. I can think of other movies that I love. Howl's Moving Castle, I think, is a similar kind of, maybe it kind of spins out a little bit. Things kind of lose. It doesn't have the kind of the typical like act structure we kind of expect. It doesn't quite have a climax like you just. Mononoke, however, does. You know, has a very strong kind of climax. Everything builds to a head with those battles, of course, you know. But I don't know if you were talking about his other movies now that you've had a chance to watch at least another one of them.
I would say you're right that Mononoke is a little more traditional. It's like a 3-act kind of scenario, but Howl's for sure is kind of like this, where you lose and then reassess the passing of time. You get lost in the film for stretches, and then you kind of are pulled out and you wonder what's going on, and you lose the thread. And so, but I'm curious what our other co-hosts think about that. So Anthony, let's go to you. I know you were a little hesitant when Spirited Away was put forth. I want to hear your flaming hot takes as well. Give us a little scenario about your history with the film, if you can, and then wherever you want to go.
Sure. So you brought up a lot of great questions to start off. And I think the one reason I was a little hesitant last time is something that Connor kind of defeated in his choice to kind of pick the movie, which was that we all seem to at least initially love this movie. And Connor brought up the question of how much of that is nostalgic. And so with that being said, I actually saw this for the first time from start to finish when I was a little bit older. But now that Connor brought up that story of seeing it on a channel, I want to say I also saw it in pieces, random pieces on Cartoon Network when they used to do their marathons. But I remember this movie even before that. So I have two quick stories. Hopefully that will help make some sense, but we'll give context. So my first story is I remember being at home as a kid and my mom had the Academy Awards, the Oscars on in the background. And I remember this movie winning Best Animated Feature, which would be, I think, 2002, Tony. It came out in 2001, 2003.
I think 2003 Oscars, I think, probably.
Oh, crap. Sorry.
I remember
a U.S. release in 2003, but it originally came out in Japan in 2002. I looked that up before this. Anyway.
I remember it winning, and I think Cameron Diaz did like the whole like hosting part of like that award. And I remember Miyazaki not showing up out of protest for the war, in the Middle East. And so I remember that in the background of my head. So maybe that's subconsciously there as like a sort of political analysis of this movie. But my second story is much more recent. It happened a couple months ago. I was talking to a friend of Shay's who lives in Oklahoma. And this friend was telling me that they're really into anime and like animated films in general, not just Japanese, but animated all across the globe. And she was telling me that there was this guy who had been crushing on her for like the past 6 months. And she had put out a tweet asking people for unfamiliar anime to recommend, so she could watch. And this guy slid into her DMs and wrote, "Have you seen Spirited Away? We should watch another one."
Okay, first of all, I didn't slide into that.
Oh,
I was very confident. I was very forthright.
All this is to say, maybe this is the movie that you go to when you're kind of trying to talk to that person. I don't know, but it's obviously still in the public consciousness somewhere. Anyway, so all that being said is my own take is, as I said last time, I really love this movie. Every time that train scene comes on where she's sitting there with no face and there's the different stops and these kind of hollow, translucent figures get off, something about that scene just really connects with me on so many different levels. And it brings me back to that feeling of, the sort of feeling of being a kid when everything is just so outside of yourself. Like everything seems to have that kind of life in a way that doesn't really exist once you kind of grow up. So that's one thing. So that maybe is nostalgic. But every time I rewatch it, and I don't remember if I saw this with you guys actually, Tony and Connor at the IFC when we were freshmen in college, but every time I see this movie, I absolutely love it. And my other point is, because Connor brought up the sort of meandering latter half, is I actually get the other kind of like senses that is normally a kind of problem for me. But with the work of Miyazaki, I feel like I am in a sort of traditional fantasy type tale, whether it's Alice in Wonderland or whether it's even a Little Princess. I feel like the meandering doesn't bother me because I get lost in this kind of fantasy. And it's a simple way of kind of exploring this world in all his movies that I really respond to, even whether it's Howl's Moving Castle, which of course isn't based on his screenplay or anything, or Kiki's Delivery Service is another one I really like. What's the Poco Rosso is the other one, the Aviator, and The Wind Rises. But all these things kind of do that. But Spirited Away, something about that really takes me away differently. I really love everything from the bathhouse to that train is just perfection to me for this animated film. And we could get more into that later.
Thank you, Anthony. And great anecdotes as well, but really a nice personal view of your relationship to the movie and to the creator as well. So let's go to Tony. Tony, round us out. What do you have to say, you cynical bastard? Let's hear it.
Well, I'll say that I put on the movie, I started watching it, couldn't stand it. It was terrible. And then Zaniba is introduced. And I'm like, now we got us a movie. And that whole bit with the totem and having to go on the train, and there was a side quest, and there's 3 new characters, and I'm like, I am in. And it's basically my favorite movie of all time, despite the unwatchable first 40%. However, that unwatchable first 40% is intentional. Miyazaki wants you to not be able to pay attention. He wants you looking at your phone the whole movie. He said this in interviews. If you're not looking at your phone the first 40% of Spirited Away, you're watching the wrong movie. I first saw this movie in 2003 in the theater. I saw this in the theater as a child. The ideal, and I remember this. I don't remember necessarily actually being in the theater and watching it, but I remember the memory. I remember the impact it had on me, because this was actually probably, because my theory is we don't remember these childhood milestones really. We remember the stories we tell about them. We remember we kind of construct our life after the fact and try to figure out where certain things happened. And I remember, because I've always been very self-obsessed and neurotic or whatever, and I would always think about these things. Back when I was like 10, and I was trying to figure out why I liked movies or why I was interested in these things or whatever, or maybe a little older. And to me, Spirited Away was kind of the obvious thing. It was like, what's the first time I really got into a movie? And it was Spirited Away. And that became sort of the one I would always say as kind of my favorite. That was kind of an easy answer. And I still say it sometimes. It's not really my favorite now, probably, but like it certainly has that nostalgic kind of sentimental attachment. And I've watched it numerous times over the years, still liking it. And I would say that, this to me is my favorite Miyazaki still. I've seen a lot of his other ones now, and none of them have it for me in the same way. I don't know what it is, but to me, I think this movie kind of has it all. It has like the wonder, the childhood innocence, the humor, the heart. This sounds like a generic pull quote for a Pixar movie, but like this movie has every tone, every aesthetic, everything you like in a Miyazaki movie is present in this movie in just the right amount. Like Porco Rosso, for instance, is much more kind of, it's the talking pig guy. It's much more kind of on the comedic side. And if you don't find Miyazaki particularly funny, you might not love it. Or Princess Mononoke is much more kind of action packed. This movie has a little bit of each thing, so that I think it kind of has something for everybody. And I think that Anthony alluded to earlier with that train scene, but I think what this movie does very successfully, more successfully than perhaps any other movie I've ever seen, is make you feel like a child. Because when you're a child, and I still feel this way, even at 27 years old, I still feel this way about certain things. The world is like very bewildering. You don't know how the world works. You don't know how the world functions. And you could depict a child navigating an adult world in like a realistic way. And the child could be bewildered, but the audience wouldn't get it because we'd just be seeing things we recognize all the time. The animation in this movie kind of exaggerates these things about our world to kind of put it through a child's eye view, right? The train, with these large people, just these large, all the characters are so large, like there's this very wide, like Zaniba / what's her name? Yabuba?
Yubaba.
Yubaba. Just what an amazing character design. Just the head that is like the size of like a dining room table or something. It's just incredibly massive. And it's like, that's how an adult person, an imposing adult person feels to a kid. And even the things that don't really make sense, the fact that they're letting the river spirit like destroy their hotel. I'm like, well, we have to let him in, I guess there's no stopping him, or just things like that. And then the next day it's all cleaned up. It's like dream logic. It's like the way a child sees and experiences the world, right? This movie came out almost 20 years ago now. Think about that. Not just like, wow, where does the time go? But like, you watch this movie now. I watched the Blu-ray. It looks incredible. It looks so good. Like, I don't think there's any real weak points here. And the color palette, the lighting, and what's really amazing about this animation, it makes me think of, I read somewhere someone once said in the context of video games that good graphics aren't about specs. They're not about the number of pixels. They're about atmosphere. They're about having the little details. They're about your character leaving footprints in the snow. Even if your game isn't like a top of the line AAA powerhouse, even if your game's not Red Dead Redemption, if you have the footprints in the snow, that's like good graphics because you paid attention and you did something to bring the people into that world. This movie is full of details like that. Every object that moves has solidity to it. They feel like real objects moving through space. Just the way that, like, in little moments like the rice rotting, turning into muck when the scent of the river spirit comes by, the way the gold does the same thing, those paper plane things just colliding with the side of the building. There's so many moments that are so visceral, not visceral in the way that like he is visceral, but visceral in the sense of like, oh, you can feel it. That feels real. You can imagine being in this space. You can imagine being in the environment. You can imagine holding these things, touching these things. You know how they feel. You know how they sound. You know how they smell. It's such an evocative movie. And I just, the attention to detail. Another detail I love that I've always loved in this movie is the three head guys bumping around. One of them gets stuck in the box, like a candy box, and he hops along and the box stays on him for like a little while before it falls away. And then later in the movie, another moment I love is when the baby becomes the little mouse and there's the little sparrow, and they reenact for the little dust mites what they just saw happen with Chihiro. It's like doing a little stage play, and it's like 2 seconds, but it's like such a, like, 90% of movies wouldn't bother to include that shot. They just included that shot because they thought it was fun. And this movie is full of just amazing details, amazing moments like that. So I think this movie is a triumph of atmosphere. And I said last time about Phantom Thread that it had maybe my favorite score of all time. This is like right up there. I mean, this score is just amazing. Particularly the main theme is like probably my favorite main theme in any movie of all time. It immediately gets me very sentimental, very nostalgic. It is so beautiful. It's just gorgeous. I mean, this movie is just gorgeous. And as for Connor's concerns about the kind of narrative sloppiness of the second half, I think that's probably true. That sounds convincing. And I, thinking back on the movie, I see what he means. But I guess for me, this movie is not about the plot. It's not about the story really at all. So even if there are narrative problems, it's almost like the narrative is just an excuse to create these moments, right? It creates that moment of them on the train, right? And it's just a setup for that. It creates the moment of them, her flying with the dragon through the sky. That's what the movie's about. And it's about that feeling. And the plot just gets us there in the way the plot in a dream is convoluted and doesn't make sense. So maybe that sounds like a cop-out. Maybe it is a cop-out. But I think for Spirited Away, it makes sense. So, yeah.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, I have to say, you hit on a lot of points that I was prepared to bring up. So that means we kind of have a kinship with regards to this film, because I think we see it in the same ways, which is interesting because for me, my first time seeing this film, my first time even really hearing of this film was from you three. I was so relatively sheltered in terms of media exposure. I guess I wasn't prohibited from seeing certain films, but it was more that from the culture that I I was kind of guided towards certain things, action movies, blockbusters, and Nickelodeon, as opposed to, Cartoon Network animation, offbeat stuff. And so I really wasn't very exposed to animation, foreign animation. So when you guys started talking about Miyazaki, I didn't know who that was, shamefully to say. And so that was like 2015, so about 6 years ago. Now I've seen, half dozen of his films, and this one for me stands the test of time. I think it's my favorite. And it's interesting because I can relate to what you guys are saying the film evokes, it evokes a certain nostalgia. It seems like we all saw the film for the first time at a different, perhaps slightly different phase of our lives. You three perhaps saw it in a more formative age, but I can still relate to the feelings of nostalgia. And I think it is true, Tony. I think it rings true, the idea that it's due to the fact that this movie makes you feel very childlike. You're thrown into a world that you can't possibly understand, with these disproportionate, zany, kind of unreal yet somehow physical creatures. The word visceral is, throughout his films, there's certain studios or creators wouldn't bother to parse out these little details in terms of like tentacles or little pieces of chocolate or jewels, right? And we see all of that in the film. We see the minute details, and that kind of only further aids in helping us kind of become absorbed by the world. And it's really interesting. The one kind of analog I can think of from my childhood is Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the initial release, where it kind of starts off, not in any similar fashion, but it starts off in a kind of sullen or, forgotten British city. And he's brought into this industrial looking place. And then all of a sudden he's getting in a shrinking room, and then bam, he's in the meadow with the lollipops and the chocolate river, and Gene Wilder's singing. And it's like this total like orgasm of the senses, right? It's like, I don't know how else to describe it. It's very, it's narcotic. It's almost like pharmaceutical in a way. In this movie, I would use the term pharmaceutical as an adjective, because it really does interact with your brain chemistry in a way that certain films don't. And it kind of triggers those receptor neurons and, mirror neurons in a really fancy way. But, I think for me, this film there is some nostalgia there for me, and I really appreciate it for that, because I couldn't necessarily find that with his other films as much. They all felt a little more just like refined, certainly creative and bombastic animated films, yet this feels unrelated to those in a certain way. Like, this movie embarrasses the studios of Pixar and Disney Animation to me. Like, it really does, and in mechanical and technical sense, but also in this intangible sense. And thematically speaking, or looking at plot construction, I think there's certainly better films out there, but like Tony said, it's kind of a means to an end, and that's fair. I would think that many people have looked at it more critically and probably sucked a little more blood from the stone, as it were. But we can try to do that now. Actually, let's segue into that, and just let's talk about kind of what is Miyazaki's aim in this film, and how would you compare it to, is this kind of just this listless adventure that is really more about atmosphere, or are there certain themes that we're meant to pay attention to? Like in Princess Mononoke, there's a very clear bifurcation between the land and industry, right? Like the nature versus humanity. This film has shades of that, of course, but like, is this a cultural product? Which I'm sure it is. It's an authentically Japanese film, right? I don't think this type of movie could be made by an American-born director who wasn't raised in a culture that was foreign from the mainstream America. I guess, there are exceptions to that. But what I'm saying is, like, the American essence, we can't really relate to the idea of, and of course there's plurality in America, but the mainstream, the Nickelodeon, the media that we consume, the idea of having that we consumed as a kid, the idea of having a river have a spirit, right? That would be pretty foreign to the likes of Hulk Hogan and Blue's Clues and Are You Afraid of the Dark, right? Like,
those are the three definitive American cultural products, to be clear.
and the day they're all reunited is the day I celebrate. But so like a positivist, like obviously capitalism underlies everything in that. Less focus on nature, more focus on individuality, transcending circumstances and free will and all that. So I'm just curious. I feel like you guys do have some thoughts on this. Like, I mean, one, given that might be a cultural artifact, are we to take anything of it that transcends cultures that we could perhaps learn from in a cross-cultural space, like something that resonates with you even today that might make sense? Or is this all just viscera, it's all just fluff and it's a kids movie, whatever, like that? And I'm curious if you all have any insight into that, or can engage in some self-reflexivity and see what you see or see what you feel.
Well, Kirk, I think one thing that's interesting about that kind of question is I'm sure every spirit, or at least a lot of them, and I'm sure a lot of the names probably have a reference to some sort of Japanese cultural or spiritual history of some sort. It's one movie I've never actually really thought about looking things up, just because I have such a personalized connection that becomes important, but less important than it may be in another movie. But I think what's interesting about this one in particular is Spirited Away, kind of as we talked about with that meandering, whatever you want to call it, structure. And this has been kind of commonly said about a lot of Miyazaki's work, but with Spirited Away in particular, he avoids the traditional Western fight with the witch at the end that any other kind of Pixar Disney movie would probably have. But not just that, one thing that's really interesting to me is how a lot of the universal themes are kind of avoided. We don't have this great romantic like structure. We have a kind of childhood love that's done, and that I've never seen quite in a similar way outside of Miyazaki's works in another movie, between Chihiro and the Dragon Aku. And like we have the sort of beautiful kind of like working relationship that a child may be expected to get into later, and that's not kind of typically shown. So we have these kind of themes, I think, that we could all kind of relate to and pull. And I think one of the reasons we probably really connect with this work is because they're universal themes, but we don't usually get those. We get the grand narrative themes in other movies. True love, the prince, the princess at the end, the kind of grand fight, the third act of killing the dragon. And it's all kind of gone in this movie for something else. And just as a quick point, I think the way that reflects this is one of my favorite moments besides the train is at the end, when she has to pin out which pig are her parents to then win their freedom from the witch. And she goes up and looks at the pin and says, I think there's a problem. None of them are my parents. And everyone just starts clapping instantly. And it becomes this great triumphant moment about just recognizing who the people that you have and love around you for who they really are and who they're not. And I think that's like a kind of great moment in that film.
Yeah, great point. And I think this film, there's a use of like a stylized contradiction in a lot of these things, where things are at once what's that Hawking term? There's a term for particles that exist but don't exist. They pop in and out of existence in certain areas of space, but I forget what the name is. But it's kind of like this, like even the soot or the runts. It seems like they almost have personalities, but what are they? They seem like little minions that are devoid of any individuality, and and also like it seems like the importance of fitting in and kind of disconnecting from whatever world we reside in and into this spirited world, but also the importance of keeping your name. And so is that true for all spirits, or is that only true for visitors of the world? And I guess these questions might be inconsequential. They do cross the mind occasionally, but I think the idea of kind of discombobulating and disorienting the viewer to where you really have to develop some trust with Miyazaki. You really have to trust that the creator is going to get you there in the end. And, that's kind of a novel thing, because, when you think about it, we usually know how we're going to land. We don't know where we're going to land in certain films, especially kids films, but we kind of know how we're going to land. I think the movie Soul, if any of you saw Soul recently, I think did a really good job of kind of eschewing some of those conventions at certain points in the film, though it did kind of border on hack, but it was at least innovative in a certain way. Whereas I don't want to shit on the films of my childhood, so I'll just spare you. But X animated film from the 90s or early 2000s, you kind of understand where you're going to land. And I guess Wally's like that a little bit too. You can kind of lose track in Wally. But anyways, I'm going off the rails. Connor,
our sponsor Fern Gully did not want you to badmouth them, so I appreciate you.
Yeah, something with an
Tony.
I think that the main theme would be things are not what they seem, right? I mean, Anthony alluded to it, the scene with the pigs and like the true form, right? All the characters have like an alternate form. Even Chihiro is Sen, right? And the witch, her main ability seems to be transforming people. She can do a Kamehameha, which she does exactly once in the movie, which was great. But she mainly transforms people into other things, as does Zeniba, which is another fun like double, right? They're all the doubles and the parents of the pigs. Is it Haku? He's a dragon and also a person, but he's also a spirit. I guess he was always a spirit. The river spirit, Two-Face, or sorry, No Face, of course. They all have these like different forms, and even with No Face, and there's often multiple levels to it. Like with No Face, she sees No Face in his, quote unquote true form, or as we see him at the end of the movie, and she lets him in, not knowing that he's going to cause all these problems, right? So there's always like another layer, and I think that the point of that is to go with the theme of childhood or being a child is like one of the main things you learn as you become an adult is that things are not what they seem, right? When you're a child, you're presented this very simplistic picture of the world and you're told to kind of rely on it. And as you get older and you realize that picture is kind of misleading, it can be very destabilizing. It can be, in some cases, traumatizing. It can be very disillusioning and upsetting or whatever. So I think what this movie does with that is it takes that idea of things are not what they seem, but that's ultimately okay. Right? Like she enters these situations that are indeed pretty scary. There are some scary, threatening, like when her parents turned into pigs, I remember seeing them being like really freaked out. I mean, it is like kind of a viscerally like horrifying thing to see the parents turned into these like horrible beasts, just gorging themselves on this food, and like, or like when Haku in dragon form, he's like bleeding. He bleeds like a lot, like for a kid's movie. That's like more blood than I've seen in any kid's movie. And there was a number of scenes like that where there is the idea of real danger, real fear, right? And Chihiro's certainly genuinely afraid, but things end up working out. She's able to face her fears. She's able to never lose her kindness, her generosity. And, every kid movie is about being nice, right? That's not particularly novel, but I guess that I like the way this movie tackles that idea of facades, tackles that idea of illusion, but not in a cynical way or not in a really negative way, but in kind of an optimistic way, because I think any situation can be interpreted optimistically if you try, and I think this movie does it in kind of a cool way.
Yeah, and then I'll get to Connor. I'm curious, did what Tony said about facades, but also kind of pulling a little bit, digging a little bit deeper here. Is there anything to be learned about death or spirituality, like the actual, as is in the name? Like what are we to learn about that? Or is that merely just the doily on the table for us to enjoy this kind of smorgasbord of sensations? But I think for me, there's kind of a critical moment where she realizes that Haku and her had some sort of interaction and that it was within her. So is this indicative of there's an I'm not even sure how you would typify it in terms of spirituality. I don't think it falls in line perhaps with Shintoism. I would say perhaps, but and I know you're not a theologist, Connor, but what would you say? Is there any doctrine you notice here in terms of life and death and life after death and the passage between, or is that just irrelevant in this scenario?
It's really interesting, Kirk. I had never even connected the idea of afterlife or death. That's obviously relevant. I mean, I think, we should be thinking in like Shintoistic terms. So this is obviously a weird kind of spirit world. But we're talking about, these kami or these yokai or these, beings that kind of stand in, right, for this sort of animistic system where everything, right, that is in our world has a kind of spirit in it. And typically, right, the encounter with the spirit world and a lot of like Japanese ghost stories is to kind of teach us a kind of respect for these various forces in the world, right? So I would say I'm having trouble like even articulating a thought on the idea of an afterlife, but the spirit world is like a kind of afterlife, and it's like this liminal space that you go to and you learn something, right? Learn something about the world. I think obviously here, right, the lesson is, I think Haku, which I never loved this moment that she just suddenly remembers kind of randomly when she's on his back, like, oh yeah, you were a river, which is kind of a doublet too of the other, I guess it was a setup, right? The stink spirit, right, turned out to be a river spirit. So then we have another river spirit. I always found it kind of odd when most of the time he's implied to be like a boy, like an orphan boy, sort of like Chihiro. But anyway, yeah, I think as I was trying to underline a note of kind of a coexistence with nature, right, which is also very much like foreshadowed in the episode of the river god, the stink spirit, right? I like what Tony says, and I think I would agree to them from the jump, right, that this thing of not quite knowing what we're looking at, these things that are deceptive, right, and this feeling of childlike wonder and confusion. I think this movie is all about that feeling of not knowing what's going on, of being a new person on the job, for instance. This is this classic kind of coming of age moment, and that runs throughout. The other, big thing I would point to, and something that does come back again and again and again, is kind of the contrast between kind of materialism. I mean that in the kind of colloquial sense, lust for material possessions and gold and money, et cetera, right? Versus, right, kind of interpersonal connections, right? And kind of personal loyalty and feeling and love, right? I think that's a consistent thing that's revisited again and again. Every single episode, every single character has a kind of moment like that, whether it's Yubaba finally kind of realizing the error of her ways, like Haku kind of provokes her by saying, your baby is not actually your baby, you lost your actual baby. Then whereas previously she'd been only obsessed with the gold that No Face will give, right? And the gold itself at that moment turns into dust or whatever, turns into coal or what have you. You learn that, right, in the end, right, it's family and the people we love that matters, right? So I think, and in general, right, from the very get-go, we have the parents who are the greedy figures who are punished, right? And I think in general, like the kind of moral is sort of don't be greedy, is kind of the overriding note, which I find a little bit kind of disappointing when compared to even Princess Mononoke, where it's kind of about more than just be nice to the environment, you guys. It really is about, I think this is a much more this is what I kind of like about the sort of Shintoistic beliefs in spirits, is that it ends up not really being about morality. It ends up being about a real kind of interpersonal coexistence with forces of nature, or it's not about kind of whether you did right or did wrong. And sometimes I think this movie is almost vindictive in the way that the parents are treated. I think the movie has certainly not much time for, these kinds of figures, these westernized, greedy figures, right? I think that's another theme, is that, even the spirit world itself has been kind of turned into this capitalistic hellscape. It is this kind of corruption that's brought on by greed and materialism, right? Which I think obviously are perfectly acceptable themes. But again, just to find my more negative slant, although I agree with all the positive things you guys have said as well. I think sometimes it's I don't know, like where the profundity is there, but I'm sure that's not really what the movie is about as much as it is the moment to moment feeling, right? Which I think you guys have described well.
I just wonder what it would feel like, how it would feel to be, say, your age or my age. I'm a little older, but back in when this film came out, and to live in Japan and to be raised Japanese and to watch this film, and what nuances would trigger associations in our brains in ways that we can't understand, right? It would almost be like akin to watching a Tarantino film as a foreigner, I might imagine, right? It feels like authentically Japanese experience for a children's film. Whereas like a Tarantino, like watching Reservoir Dogs or watching Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it feels very, very American, both in, construction and theme. But you're right, go ahead.
Or just on that note, because that is an interesting thing. Do you guys know the like, I know a little bit about this. Like, I know that Spirited Away was a commercial success in Japan, and it was very acclaimed in Japan, right? but Miyazaki has this esteem in America, like among Americans, even like casual film goers know about Miyazaki, right? You know, and his movies are very widely watched and shared among people of all ages, but a lot of them like young people, like people on kind of our demographic. So I wonder how is he, do you get any of you know like how he's seen in Japan as opposed to America? Because I wonder if it could be kind of thing where like Kurosawa, for instance, well now this revered figure of international cinema, I think wasn't like even the top 10 most popular directors or highest grossing directors when he was alive in Japan or something. That might be an exaggeration, but the point is he was not as popular as he would become in subsequent decades, right? Yeah.
I don't know the full extent of his critical or popular reception, but I do know for a fact, and you maybe already know this story, or I don't know if you guys know it either, Kirk or Connor, but so Studio Ghibli is of course like a very fascinating like animated company, but none of their movies are successful except pretty much for Hayao Miyazaki's movies, which essentially kept the company afloat. And when he essentially retired, they had disaster after disaster, and the company went bankrupt for a while. Until things kind of pulled him out. So Miyazaki himself was enough, at least, of a box office and critical draw to basically keep an animated company alive. And in fact, I don't know the full, if this is quite true, if what I read was kind of like the cynical view of it, but it's kind of implied that one of the reasons he made the deal with Disney at the time was to also bring in some outside revenue to keep the company kind of going if he were to have passed at that time.
That is interesting context. The fact that Disney kind of hooked up with Ghibli in the first place, like kind of says something, right? You know, but
right. Yeah. And then we get into kind of the meta narrative of creative freedom and coming under the, signing a contract with old Walt Ubaba Disney, but that's for another time. I feel like I gave Connor short shrift in this episode, and I feel a little guilty. And I just wanted Connor, you to have the opportunity just to kind of express, perhaps pontificate about what it is about Miyazaki, perhaps as a creator, or how he contrasts to looking at animation that, we perhaps grew up with, or I grew up with, Disney Studios, Pixar, DreamWorks, that kind of stuff, Sony Animation. What did you see? Do you have any feelings, or do you have any insightful contrast that you'd like to bring out?
Yeah, as for how it stacks up with other, Disney and, I'm not crazy about animation. I'm not crazy about, though I do really like animation, I think. I'm not quite like a Disney guy. Like I don't have extreme nostalgia for, though I watched a lot of cartoons growing up, but Kirk, obviously I kind of prefer Miyazaki and his ethos. I think it's so much more mature and interesting, and there's so much more, kind of glorying in the art of animation itself, calls attention to its own animatedness. There's something like, this couldn't be anything else in an animated movie, even the ones that are adaptations like Howl's. It's like what would be the appeal of this without, that somehow Miyazaki just gets that. He really just makes the most of this kind of thing. Whereas, some other Disney style affairs, it's kind of, the animation is kind of to pull the kids in, you feel at times. Whereas this, it's kind of like, there is an amazing kind of just pure love of the art form to it that I think cannot be beat. And this is a particularly good example of it, but I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it certainly did. And I think there's really, I don't know how you said it. It's hard to recall, but, something about like the animatedness, right? Like it draws attention to the craft. And I think there's just a level of like, I don't know, perspicacity and like sensibility, right, in these films that they're very self-aware. And I don't think you necessarily get that with the commercially driven kind of boardroom meeting iterations that we have in America, or at least have had in the last, 10 years, accepting certain Pixar films. Anyways, let's head to the voting now. I think we've said a good amount on the film. If you have any kind of tying things together, or just maybe ending on a high note or a low note, any sort of snide remark, let's hear it now. And we'll start with Tony, and then we'll go to Connor, and then we'll go to Anthony. We'll finish with Anthony.
All right, I think I got it out of my system. This is a yes. There's not a whole lot to add. I mean, this is to me one of the classics of animation, not just modern animation, but of any canon of like animated films. I think Spirited Away needs to be in there. I think you make a good case that it is the Miyazaki to put there if you're only going to pick one, although he obviously has numerous canon-worthy films. Definitely a nostalgic and sentimental favorite, and for everything else I've said, definitely a yes.
This movie, it's a Miyazaki movie. Not sure quite stacks up with some of my personal favorites. It's got the crossover appeal, which you know. But despite this being an anime for girlfriend havers, and therefore hardly an anime at all, I think I can give it a yes. Because it's Miyazaki. It's an incredible bit of animation. I hold to my critique of the second half, which may be true of many of his other movies as well. I can see how it works for many people. Maybe I just had my critical glasses on a bit too tight this time. But yeah, obviously there's so much to recommend it.
Okay, fair enough. So we got two yeses. Anthony, are you going to give us a meaningless dissenting vote, or how are you going to vote?
No, it's going to be an easy yes. So it's a full unanimous. Everyone, is throwing Spirited Away into the bucket that is the 706 canon. But I want to add just quick thoughts because I didn't get the cool what I would have my son watch question. But one thing I just wanted to add real quick is, because we brought up Princess Mononoke so much, is there's an obvious like cynicism to a lot of Miyazaki's work. And I was really curious because to me, at least in comparison, Spirited Away really tampers it down in comparison to a lot of his work. I'm thinking of like The Wind Rises. And if you're an adult or you know historical context for some of his films or cultural context, that cynicism really comes out. But in Spirited Away, it just doesn't really seem there. And I wonder if that's also an informed response on some level, whether it's gut instinctual or regardless, I don't know. But it's just something I wanted to point it out.
Could it also have been for commercial reasons, right? You got the rat cutting the checks down in Orlando. So anyways, good point, Anthony. Well taken. 3-0. We'll take it. Spirited Away is now in the 706 canon. We have a Miyazaki in. I think we got a Kurosawa in a little while ago too. So we're looking better by the day. Let's just say that much. And now we will move on to our final segment, which is where I will choose from 3 nominated films, and whichever one piques my fancy, we will watch next and see if it's worthy. So I believe Anthony is still least recent. He's on a little bit of a cold streak, but let's see if he can change that up by nominating the Andrew McCabe film again. And then Tony will do Mishima and Connor Iron Giant. Let's hear it.
All right. Well, I'll go first, just because I'm on that cold streak, and then I'll let Connor and Tony decide for themselves who wants to go second and third. So, all right, Kirk, I got a movie, and it's a little out of my normal wheelhouse of selections, but a couple of things. One, you like to switch things up. You like to do things that a sort of popular crowd might be into. Two, I feel like we owe you something for that poor selection of Halloween films. So I'm going to nominate a horror film. One of my favorites. It's from the 1980s, and we give in the 1980s some really short shrift. I feel like Tony might have seen it, but it's Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead from 1981, starring Bruce Campbell, in which, a group of attractive teenagers go to a cabin, discover a book containing a portal to the dead, a portal to hell, essentially, and all hell breaks loose. And it is just so viscerally great. Shay and I watch this every October, but I'm ready to watch it for Halloween in May or June, depending on when we film it. So that's my pick.
Yeah, we had half Halloween, not a few weeks ago, the official holiday now. But great choice. Let's hear from Connor or Tony. Who wants to be brave and go second?
I'll go second. I think there may be some advantage we've seen before. Going second. Kirk recommends something that I know Tony has seen, but has been one of my personal gems that I've been or personal kind of eggs I've been sitting on for a while that I've been looking forward to sharing with the podcast. This is 1957's A Face in the Crowd, directed by Elia Kazan. Sure, we can talk about Elia Kazan. He has his own history. Anyway, this is a movie starring Andy Griffith, where he plays this character named Lonesome Rhodes, who's kind of a wandering kind of troubadour guitarist who becomes sort of swept up, becomes kind of a radio star, and ends up kind of becoming kind of a political mouthpiece, kind of a conservative political mouthpiece. So this has gotten a lot of play recently, or in the past 4 years at least, because a lot of people read it as like the movie that predicted Trump. Okay, so it's got a lot of play on that front. I think it's a great movie otherwise, right? And certainly I think what my favorite thing about it is the element of the political commentary, the element of its analysis of politics at that time, which end up, yes, very much feeling very prescient. Not necessarily of Trump. I don't really love the Trump aspect, or the Trump reading, that it's somehow we read only through the lens of Trump, but it's rather, I think, a very interesting take on a general cultural shift that happened in the 50s, the sort of political status quo that we still kind of are living in, or maybe now, only now moving out of, but the kind of the relationship between media and politics, entertainment and politics, the relationship between, conservatism and sort of populism, all these things are relevant. And this is a movie that I think has a really interesting snapshot of its time. And it's also just a very amusing, well-written, interesting film to boot.
How would you categorize the film though? Is it like political satire, or is there like a romantic element to it? Or
I would call it like mostly a drama, but it's sort of about the character of Lonesome Rhodes and his kind of his rise and his fall. It's kind of a drama in that sense. There's definitely some like comedic moments in it, but I would say it's overall kind of a drama. It's kind of a tragedy type story with, there's also a love interest character. There's personal relationships that play a role against the backdrop of this, kind of spectacular rise to stardom.
it sounds actually pretty appealing.
I really
something I
want
haven't
you
seen.
to see it, Kirk. Yeah, I'm really curious about what you would make of it.
So let's round out. Tony, what do you have for us?
All right, Kirk. So a little while back, you said we need more comedies. We need more populist mainstream choices that people from Nebraska would like. And I'm calling you on that. I am challenging you, because if you don't pick my movie, you don't get to say that anymore. You don't get to say it, because I have a movie that is for that. That is an answer to that. As a movie, a type of movie we have never done before, and that is The Other Guys by Adam McKay, starring Will Ferrell and Mark Wahlberg. This is, I'm not kidding, one of the funniest movies of the past decade. This movie is hilarious. I just resaw it on TV. It's on TV a lot. And it still slays. There are so many great jokes in that movie. And of course, you have Adam McKay kind of starting out as the Will Ferrell guy, kind of the, sketch comedy SNL guy, kind of developing kind of a political consciousness. Now he makes these kind of political movies. And The Other Guys is kind of that point where he starts to kind of make that pivot, although it's still obviously a very big, funny, but yeah, there's the political comments. There is. Why you would, it's in the movie. I'm not saying it's.
Was that before or after The Rock jumped off the roof?
You're saying that political satire can't be broad and goofy?
I guess it's fair. That, I guess my point in and of itself is a little bit satirical, but the point of the movie I'm referencing. But yeah. Continue.
I mean, I basically said it, but anyway, I think it would very much mix it up, and it's definitely not like a typical Tony movie, I would say. And I don't know. I think it'd be good to do at least one movie like this. I mean, honestly, the past 10 years, how many canon-worthy mainstream wide-release comedies are there? I would say not that many, but I think this is one that you could make an argument for. So,
all right. So I'm conflicted, as always. There isn't a clear choice here for me, so I need some help. Anthony, if you'd wish to rebut, I'm sure you have no qualms with picking The Other Guys, right, Anthony? That sounds like just right up your wheelhouse.
Okay, well, right. I got to start off with the normal. I've seen both of these movies. I saw Connor's movie because it was on a list about movies that so-called like predicted Trump and the rise of Fox News on Instagram's like Criterion page or whatever years ago. I saw Tony's movie when I was in high school after school one day, and I thought it was propaganda then. It's propaganda now. um, so okay, I don't know how to rebut this. We need more comedies, but you know what we need more of? Horror movies. When's the last time we done a horror movie? And The Evil Dead has some great comedic elements in there. Some of the greatest special effects I've ever seen. It's absolutely visceral, and we overuse that word, but it's totally true with this movie. It is something that bro from Nebraska with a bud in his hand would totally enjoy as he's bouncing beer pong off, I don't know, some table in the backwoods. I don't even know how to describe Nebraska, but there's that.
That was the most elitist sentence I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
Yes, he's hanging out at University of Nebraska. He has his football jersey on, his LeBron James cap. I don't know. We got to do The Evil Dead. That's my pitch.
All right. So Connor, you kind of have you're going up against two genre films. Make the case that your film is worthy of skipping on getting a little bit of a dose of these kind of sideshow attractions.
Kirk, I was just about to say, we need more black and white dramas at the 706. No, of course. I really admire the effort to diversify. This is definitely firmly in my wheelhouse, the kind of straight on, kind of golden age Hollywood drama, with vaguely left-wing political musings, right? There's nothing that will sort of just about the general description of the movie that will shock you, Kirk, and certainly it fits among some of my absolute favorites. Depends on what you're in the mood for. I think this is something though that has a lot of fun. It has its satirical moments that are very curious and interesting to see, kind of in hindsight. That being said, I think you would get a kick out of it. In addition to finding it, kind of enriching and also, giving you a lot to think about in terms of, modern politics, or certainly the history of, politics in the U.S. And I think it's worth it for that. I think we would all have a good conversation about it. It's not an untouchable movie in any way, too. I'm sure my fellow co-hosts would have their critiques and counterpoints as well. I think we'd get a really good conversation out of it. But that being said, I haven't seen The Evil Dead, and I'm sorry I haven't, and it appeals to me. And as for the other guys, it's very funny because it's a movie that it's not in the kind of the canon of the great comedies, but I remember really enjoying it. I've always laughed about it with people, remember the other guys? Yeah, that was actually really funny. So it's weird how it was too late to somehow enter the canon of the Anchormans and whatnot. So very curious movie. Very interesting and funny movie. Interesting always to revisit a comedy, because sometimes they can really, especially comedies from the last 10 years or whatever, sometimes they can really fall flat. I don't know. It would be interesting to revisit it and see what happens. I'd give it a shot too.
I've seen all these movies. I think they're all good choices. Evil Dead I like because I feel like Evil Dead 2 is the one most people go for. I think most people have a preference for Evil Dead 2, and that's the one you hear more discussed. So I think Evil Dead 1 sometimes gets a little bit short shrift. What's interesting about it is that it is functionally the same as Evil Dead 2 in terms of the plot, but the movie feels very different. It's a very different feel. I think it'd be interesting to do Evil Dead and then Evil Dead 2 and kind of compare them, if we wanted to do that as well. But I think that Facing the Crowd, I think, is a classic Connor pick, classic 706. Very, very good. Very, very chewy. Really fascinating time capsule. And I get to tie in Rick Perlstein's The Invisible Bridge, which I just read because he talks about that movie in the book. And I agree that the Trump analogy is pretty strained. It doesn't really fit. I mean, it fits in the most surface level way, but I still think there are modern parallels you can draw with this character and with this, the media, the role of the media, which has obviously changed so much. But I'd be fine with any of these. As for the other guys, I just think it's the most different from anything we've done. I think you can't say there's no precedent. There is a precedent for Evil Dead, I think, a little bit. It is fairly different. It is fairly novel, but I think Other Guys is more different for us. So,
all right. So I like where your head's at, Tony. I do. And those movies, I've seen pretty much all of them, like the Adam McKay, the SNL kind of offshoots. MacGruber, I think, is one that honestly, the other guys is underrated, but MacGruber is like clinically underrated, like severely underrated. So I just feel like there are better ones that have a better shot of actually getting in. Something like 50-50, the Seth Rogen film about dealing with cancer. That film, has those comedic elements and that kind of style, but it also deals with a little bit more. Connor, your film Facing the Crowd is definitely one, I got to add to my list, my ever-growing list. Whenever I fucking talk to you guys, I have like 8 movies I need to add to my list. Not because you're pressuring me to watch them, just because you guys are so well versed in cinema and you guys watch really cool shit. And so I got to watch it. I do feel like for some reason, like A Place in the Sun is still fresh in my head, and it's not at all the same. And I know that, but I feel like I don't want to go back if I have my druthers just yet. And I feel like we have undervalued the 70s. And I think The Evil Dead is from the 70s or early 80s, Anthony.
The 81, I believe.
Okay, whatever. That time, like Escape from New York, The Warriors, like that when cinema was kind of like, going off the rails, and we were heading towards a new version of what was marketable and what the audience wanted. And so I want to see where The Evil Dead fits into that picture. And also, I just want to kind of talk a little bit more about like traditional canonical horror films. Like we saw Monkey Shines, but that's not a film that I think is
you dare
top shelf. That's well whiskey. You know what I mean?
Definition of top shelf, but anyway, maybe not for everyone.
We're reaching for the blue label here. Okay, we're going up there, and we're gonna pour, next to the George Romero's and the Simon Killers. We're gonna pull it down, and we're gonna take a look, and we're gonna see how it tastes. We're gonna swish it around in our mouths. So prepare to talk about The Evil Dead. And I haven't seen the second one, and I might not watch it, but I'll just judge it based on my initial experience. I haven't seen it. I've seen the modern remake, and I really enjoyed it for like how no holds barred it was with its gore and its brutality. So I'm interested to see how it compares to the original. Also, final thought, I have been kind of dabbling with the new Resident Evil game, so I am in a little bit of a horror kick. And it should be fun to get some scares and get some, some of that sensation, the adrenaline going. And also having Anthony host it just seems like a really cool combo. So I'm excited.
I think it's a great choice. I think we're all pleased with this one. I can't wait to swish around in my mouth.
That's what she said, but that's not our closing. Anthony, go ahead.
I'll have what she's having.